from the very beginning, farm workers, amongst other workers, have been carved out from some of the protections that we think extend to all other workers. I don't know if how many people here can tell me where, after how many hours you're paid overtime in the state of California.
If you're a farm worker, 60. Right?
60 hours in a week. A regular worker, 40 hours. In a day, a non-farm worker, 8 hours. A farm worker, 10 hours. I think it's incumbent on us to ask why. Why when they're working out in the hot sun? Why when it's one of the types of work that has the most it can be some of the most dangerous work. Why do we not have laws that compensate farm workers in the same way that other workers are compensated? I mentioned that it's dangerous work, but yet only 13 states offer the same types of workers' compensation protections to farm workers that they do to all other workers. Half of the states don't have any protection. That means if I'm a farm worker and I'm hurt at work, I have no recourse under the law. The laws that protect and protect the right to organize do not extend to farm workers in the way that they extend to other farm workers. And something that is the most challenging for us as attorneys, we have a system of subcontracting within farm labor that makes it almost impossible for us to really get at the actors that are driving the economic forces. Very often, when we file a lawsuit against a farm labor contractor, a small-time employer compared to the large agribusiness that's really kind of setting the standards for farm workers. But the way our legal system is set up, we cannot get at the larger employers. And that creates a situation in which we cannot hold the people who are liable and responsible and have the means to really make the changes responsibly liable using our legal system. So the other legal system at work here is immigration, our immigration laws. We don't know the true numbers, but I think it's commonly known that a significant percentage of farm workers are actually undocumented. And does anybody here know when the last comprehensive immigration reform took place? I think it was before some of you were born, right? 1986. 1986, so 30 years. It's gonna be 30 years. That means, 30 years, did I do my math right? Yes, 30 years. One more year, it'll be 30 years. That means we have people, farm workers living in this country who have been living in the United States for 20, 25 years who are undocumented. And it's interesting to me when I hear the commentary, well, why don't people just regularize? That's the vocabulary now. Why don't they just get a visa? Why don't they just become citizens? Because they can't. There is no legal means for any of those people to get a visa, to get a work permit, to become a legal permanent resident, to become a US citizen. Until Obama's recent executive order, most of those people didn't have a means of getting a work permit. And so what happens is you have in the agricultural industry a lot of employers who make it a point of hiring undocumented workers with the purpose of exploiting them, with the purpose of not paying their wages, with the purpose of acting with impunity. Now, I know that as a consumer, when you're standing in front of like those beautiful offerings at Berkeley Bowl, because they're beautiful, you don't know. You don't know if that fruit or vegetable that you're choosing was picked by somebody who was sexually harassed. You don't know if that worker was paid all of their wages. There is no way that you can know. That information is not available to you. So it's very hard right now, the way it stands, for you to influence change as an individual consumer. But I encourage you to continue to be curious about your food, because you're not just consumers, you're social actors. And there are other forums where you can voice what your principles are around food and what a just labor market should look like. Thank you.
evening. My name is Liesl Holdenried, and I'm an attorney in our Salinas office. I've been with CRLA for about 6 years now, and the majority of my practice revolves around representing farm workers in employment discrimination cases. I would say that's about 85% of my practice, and then the remaining 15% deals with farm worker housing, the lack of farm worker housing, and a small percentage focuses on U visas, which allows us to represent farm workers who have been a victim of a crime like sexual assault in the workplace, and if that person is undocumented and they help law enforcement officials prosecute or investigate the case, then they are eligible to get a temporary visa for 4 years and eventually adjust their status. But like Marcella said, there really is no other recourse for undocumented farm workers to gain their legal status. So Eric asked me to talk to you a little bit about the type of cases that I work on primarily, and so I also do a lot of wage and hour cases. So what that means is, for example, I had represented about 13 workers recently, and they were all guest workers. So what that means is that an employer has to tell the U.S. Department of Labor that there's a shortage of workers, and then they apply to bring workers in from mostly Mexico, but also on the East Coast, Jamaica, and in Hawaii. Recently there was a case a huge case where there was some labor trafficking involved, and it was a lot of workers from Thailand. So, but mostly in California, employers are bringing workers from Mexico, and they're promising them that they are going to pay a certain wage rate, and the U.S. Department of Labor sets that wage rate. And then they're supposed to pay all visa fees, they're supposed to pay travel expenses, they're supposed to pay for housing. And what I've seen in every one of my cases is that they don't pay for housing. They charge my clients for housing about $100, more than $100, $150 a month. So their weekly wages might be somewhere between $200 and $300, and they're paying $100 to $150 a month. They're paying something like $1,600 to $1,700 for expenses, visa fees, just employers trying to recover the costs of paying for that program. They're not paying the set wage rate. They're not paying for travel time. So oftentimes, if workers have to get on a bus to go to the fields, they're not being paid for that time. That's wage theft. That's work being done by my clients, and it's not being compensated for. And this is just all fundamentally, it's just so, it's beyond unfair. It's just something that my clients are basically living on the financial edge. So each week that they aren't paid correctly, each week that they aren't paid at all, what often happens is that there's a promise, well, I'll pay you next week, and so they want to stick it out because it might be difficult to find another job. Or a lot of times, my clients don't have a car, so they have to pay somebody to drive them to work. And so their job is tied to a means of transportation, and if they lose that means of transportation, or if they lose that job, they lose the transportation too. So what's even more, like, creates a more vulnerable situation for my clients is when their housing is tied to their employment. And what employers do not like it when workers complain. And so what I've seen many times, and it's actually it's hard to litigate, but we do it, is when cases of retaliation. So I have a client where we've now just reached a confidential settlement, but he was an irrigator, and he was exposed to pesticides, and his whole crew was exposed to pesticides, and he became very ill, and he started vomiting, and everybody exited the field, and they called their foreman, and they said, hey, we cannot go back in that field. It's been recently sprayed, and it's making us all sick. So he said, okay, hold on, I'm gonna call the supervisor. And they all use these kind of radios, so you can hear both people speaking back and forth. And so the supervisor says, oh, they're not gonna go back into the field? I want everybody's names, and I'm gonna talk to the boss, and we'll see who lasts till the end of the day. That's what happens. And you know what they did? They all went back into the fields, and they suffered through it. So my client went back in because he felt like he had no choice, and again, he became ill. And he said, listen, I need somebody to take me to the hospital. I'm really sick. And they said, no, just take a pill, take an aspirin, you'll be fine. So he drinks some soda, and then he falls to his knees and he begins to vomit. And at that time, his wife had just, conveniently, she was bringing him some lunch, thank goodness. And